What you think about waking up to that snow this morning? Was it just a, oh well, here we go? What was your emotion?
I was prepared for it.
You were prepared.
Yeah, and it's not something that you need to get your snowblower out from. So it looked nice until people started driving on it.
Snow. I remember not knowing what a snowblower is. Those were the days, the days before Minnesota. But if it weren't for Minnesota, I wouldn't have learned about the Schubert Club. They've been great friends, and we're glad to have them as a supporter here. Since 1882, Schubert Club has been cultivating a passion for music and fosters an engaged community of music enthusiasts through concerts, music education, museum exhibits, and student scholarships. More on Schubert Club here in a few minutes. But when I think about that snow, I'm thinking about taking refuge. It's the one thing I will say is very cozy to wake up on a Monday morning and the streets are covered in snow, and knowing that you don't have to go out there in it, at least not me anyway. It just makes me feel very cozy and safe. Like, I've taken refuge somewhere. What do you think about taking refuge? What do you think about when you hear that word, refuge?
I was about to say my home, but really I think it's radar.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah,
that's so sweet.
I know I don't want to be trite or anything, but if radar's around, then things are good. But yeah, I would say more broadly, my home. I'm a nester.
Yeah, me too. I've learned to be. But let's say you're out and about, you're on a business trip or you're wherever, and it starts to pour down rain, or you just need to kill 45 minutes before you go to your next thing. What is the what gets you into a space as far as that sort of refuge? What do you need to see glowing in neon in the window or whatever? What are you attracted to when it comes to taking refuge publicly?
Someplace that has a healthy bustle but is not a madhouse busy. No televisions.
Oh, okay.
And maybe one musician over in the corner not playing something. The crowd isn't there for the music. The music is a nice compliment.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of someplace like Tongue in Cheek on the east side.
Sure,
some little dimly lit place where you can have a drink and a nap or blow a whole wad of cash, whichever you choose.
It's so sad as a musician, as music lovers. It seems like most of the musicians I know kind of pack up and leave a restaurant as soon as they see some live music about to start.
Right.
But the issue is that it's just always so loud.
It takes over.
Oh my goodness. But when I go to New York, I was in New York last week for work. I often find myself somewhere out and about, and I have a short amount of time to just do nothing, or, time to kill before my next meeting, 30 minutes, an hour or whatever. And last week I found myself in that situation. I was in Little Italy. I had a dinner meeting that wasn't going to start for another 45 minutes. So I was walking up and down the street. Weather's nice, so I'm just kind of peeking around, but I want to grab one drink. And I come up on this door that's glowing pink and blue. The colors inside reminded me exactly of my own home, So I was like, oh,
okay, there's the nesting thing again.
I guess someone has, similar taste. But it said Gigi's Lounge. Shout out to Gigi's Lounge in New York. And I peek my head inside, and there's all of this fancy Victorian furniture. And like I said, the lights are glowing, but it's kind of empty. You talk about you like to see a place with a healthy bustle. Well, this place was a little empty. So I was like, well, is this a private party or I wonder if I should go in there? But I just said, whatever, let's just see. So I walk in and sit at the bar, and it just happened to be empty in there. And I had my little fancy, hipster drink that the bartender made. I hate that I can't remember her name. And just as I'm looking around and feeling the vibe of the place, I was really feeling that refuge, as stressful as work can be sometimes. And of course, New York will just try to kill you. I mean, it is a living organism that just beats you down. No, of course not. But, but just being in that space for that amount of time with the soft, colors and a nice drink and some really nice music, it really painted the picture. And one of the songs that kind of got my ear as I was enjoying this moment of peace is one that I didn't know by an artist I didn't know. So I just wanted to share a little bit of it here in the intro. It's a tune called Best to You by an artist known as Blood Orange. Let's listen to a little of this.
But I'd rather be nothing to you than be a part of something best to you.
So I'm sure you can imagine it, picture it, it's hustle and bustle and taxis and people and all of that stuff outside, but you're in this place, it feels warm, it feels safe, and you have this vibe going. It's
nice.
a vibe, isn't it?
It's very good.
What is it about the general aesthetic of this tune that kind of grabs your ear? It grabbed my ear. I wonder what it is for you.
That's right. That's something that you really can't define, can you? That it seems to tap into that familiarity area, but you don't know why you know it.
Yeah.
It just seems like it might be the B-side of an album that you like. I don't know.
So in this, what I'll call a perfect unease in a place of peace. You have this city that's all around you. You're surrounded by concrete and brick, and you're in this space that feels soft and cozy and like a refuge. I asked the bartender, after a while, there's no one coming in there, so I just kind of pick up conversation, and I ask her about, are you from here? Do you live here? What's going on? So I learned a bit of her story, and I just want to ask her, is it worth it? What all of the things that you have to sacrificing space, spending so much money, is it really worth it to you to be a New Yorker?
What'd she say?
She was talking about how her first year in New York, in retrospect, she has to say no because that was COVID and she couldn't really go anywhere.
Oh, she hadn't been there long.
What is it to live in New York and you have to be trapped in your box? You could live anywhere. Why am I spending $4,000 a month, to not do anything, but eventually she talks about, getting into it and, happy to be there and no regrets. I wonder how you determine if something is worth it or not, and how long you stick with something. I wonder how many times in your life have you asked yourself that question? Am what I'm doing right now, is it worth it? When was the last time you asked yourself that, honestly?
Let's see. I can measure
what
that.
time is it?
I can measure that by my watch.
But really, like, can you remember a time when you were really pondering that for yourself?
Yeah. I lived here for maybe 3 or 4 years, and just the things on the social front weren't happening, and working overnight, it really made it a challenge, you know, and I wasn't blaming anybody. I was just like, I think this is about it. And of course something happened, some little thing happened that turned me around in a moment, just as quickly as I went down that rabbit hole.
Right.
Yeah. I don't remember what it was, but something good happened, I have no idea.
Sometimes lately, if I'm going to be honest, this is called TRILLOQUY. There have been times when, I've asked myself, is it worth it? It's a lot on my body, on my nerves to, travel back and forth. And then it's not like I'm on vacation once I get to New York City. Like, I'm hustling and bustling just like the rest of the people doing the rat race there. And, it can be really stressful. It can be just, I don't know, very fatiguing on not only the body, but the spirit. So I think that question is something that I ask myself often, not as a means of complaining, but just making sure that I want to stay in it. If I ask myself, okay, I am exhausted right now, I'm ready to go home, is this worth it? If I can really come to what I'm doing with that raw energy and come out on the other side, continuing the journey, I think that's proof of purpose.
But that brings up a very good question, because you have proved that you don't need to be in a brick and mortar media production. You're doing all of your production right here. So what keeps you from going back to Knoxville and commuting to New York from Knoxville?
I've gotten in a little trouble in Knoxville, first of all, so there's a little bit of that. But also it's the network that I've built here. I don't take for granted, of course, getting to spend time with you each and every week, and all of the other people that I've met, all of the artists, all just the regular folks. I feel, I was at a birthday party last Friday. Shout out to Clara, happy belated birthday. One of the things that we were talking about was the fact that groups of friends here in Minnesota tend to be groups of transplants.
100%, that's right.
And there are a lot of people who never find that group, never really find that in, and end up moving away or just not really having a great time here in Minnesota for many years. I don't take for granted the network and the friends that I've cultivated. I think that's one of the main reasons why we're still here and not.
It took a
anywhere.
solid 8 years for that to happen for me.
Yeah. But I think, really the point I want to make here in this introduction is that, we talk about refuge, we talk about safe feelings, but we also can't take for granted the opportunity to dialogue and get into conversation. Yes, I was enjoying the music and GG's and the vibe, but getting to really have an honest conversation that speaks to some of my experience, that was speaking to her experience. Is it worth it? Do you feel like you're on the right path? There's a lot of learning there. There's a lot of sharing there. I think learning from the intersections of our shared realities is how we become more informed, more well-rounded, and just folks who know how to engage the world. It's, if anything, definitely what we try to do here on this podcast called TRILLOQUY. Let's go ahead and jump in. I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is TRILLOQUY, Opus 174. Thank you so much for continuing to listen to this little show of ours. To returning listeners, we could not do this without you. Thank you so much for your continued support. To new listeners, if this is your first time checking out the TRILLOQUY podcast, TRILLOQUY is a podcast that takes the phrase and the concept of classical music and sits it next to conversations that haven't always been in the concert hall. We apply it to stories that fit into that idea of classical music in a different way, all toward the ultimate goal of decolonizing classical music, creating a so-called genre that affects more people and speaks to our perspectives and experiences in a more genuine way. For more information on the TRILLOQUY podcast, to learn more about the background, to listen to past opuses, and to contribute, visit our website, TRILLOQY.org. In addition to your very generous support for the TRILLOQUY podcast comes from Schubert Club. They have some exciting stuff coming up in December. On December 5th, they're releasing their latest museum mini. So we were talking about the Music Museum minis last week with Maria Issa with her drum video. By the way, now that I'm thinking about it, she did end up winning her race. So, Maria Issa is officially, well, I guess she's the representative elect, but my state representative, so someone I know and someone who the community knows. It's an exciting time to have. So congratulations and shout out to Maria Issa. Anyway, in the latest Schubert Club Music Museum mini that they're putting out on December 5th is going to feature a demonstration of the French horn. I couldn't get the word demonstration out. A demonstration of the French horn by Kevin Newton, who's one of the newest, I think the newest member of Imani Winds. It says here, listen to the French horn played by Kevin Newton of Imani Winds. Discover how the prominent bell, rotary valves, and up to 12 feet of curved tubing help produce the bold yet velvety sounds of the French horn. You don't hear a French horn described as velvety every day, do you? I guess when Kevin Newton is playing it, though,
bold and velvety.
Right. So that's coming out on December 5th. Shout out to Kevin Newton. And then also on December 5th, Accordo is playing a concert. They're a string quartet with former members of the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra and the Minnesota Orchestra. They're doing a repeat show on December 6th at Ice House in Minneapolis.
Cool.
I think it's cool, all the stuff that Ice House has.
It's a great space.
in their space, this bar that just showcases all sorts of music. Anyway, you can learn more about all of Schubert Club's upcoming events at schubert.org. Huge shout out to everyone over there, and thank you for your continued support of the TRILLOQUY podcast. Elijah Daniel Smith comes back in the third movement for part 2 of our conversation. Very happy to feature him. I'm gonna bring in some music by Shawn Okpebholo in the second movement. What's your second movement music? What are you digging into?
There's a piece called A Different Soldier's Tale by James Lee III.
Oh yeah.
We missed Veterans Day. We didn't mention Veterans Day last week, so this is sort of a retrospective on on this year's
Shout out
Veterans
to all
Day.
the veterans.
Yes.
Thank you for your service. And then in the TRILLOQUY, I'm gonna mention a couple things, including politics, because I'm gonna dip my toe into that pond just a little bit, but that's not until the fourth movement. So we're gonna jump now into the very first movement. So one of the things I want to talk about in this first accidental that I'm giving a sharp is the idea of classical music, so-called classical music, intersecting with broader media, written media, radio, of course, but now we're talking about social media and all these things. I know, Scott, that all generations, every latest generation think they just invented something, that they reinvented the wheel. But can you not admit to some degree that my generation, millennials and younger, have placed conversations that are approximate to classical music in broader spaces, in new spaces, and applied them in new ways?
That's fair.
I mean, you got to give us that much.
Sure.
I mean, what was the edginess that was happening for your generation on radio, and what ways do you think new ground was being covered when you were starting your career in radio and doing that stuff?
Trying to make people understand that Philip Glass and Michael Torke were okay. It's okay.
Your date is not ruined by a few repeated notes, okay?
Right.
Well, I'm mentioning that because I'm just so happy to be in the classical music ecosystem as a podcaster alongside our friends over at Classically Black. Shout out to Delaney Harris, and extra shout out this week to Katie Brown, who wrote a piece that's getting a lot of attention from icareifyoulisten.com. She wrote, "What classical musicians can learn from HBCU marching bands." Again, congratulations and shout out to Katie Brown for this really incredible piece. So you know what HBCU marching bands are now. I'm sure that wasn't always the case. What was your exposure to the marching bands of historically Black colleges and universities?
I found out about it probably late grade school, early junior high, because my neighbor buddy Joe played on a drum line.
Oh, at a different at the school in a different part of town?
And he was 2 houses over.
Okay, go on. Continue.
He's 2 houses over. So yeah, they would take me to the competitions.
Oh, okay. Oh,
and,
nice.
And I learned about HBCUs through the back door of that.
Gotcha. And that unique style of musicking that they do. I remember when Beyonce's Homecoming came out and everyone was talking about that. Of course, her show was very reminiscent, an ode to that culture. I remember one of the things you're talking about is a sense of identity, a sense of community that's showcased in that type of music making. I wonder if you can say more to that. What do you see when you see those dancers and those instrumentalists and all those folks in step and really into it? You're sensing some community there.
Of course, but there's also a bit more of a fascination with it because I simply didn't have it around me growing up. And since I didn't find out what an HBCU was until I was probably in junior high school, maybe even early. It doesn't matter when. I was young.
Yeah.
And I didn't see it around me. And I'm not afraid to say that my high school band was not good.
Sure.
They were not cutting
a lot of them aren't. I mean, if we really go get to it.
Right. So that was, the halftime show wasn't as much of a spectacle.
Yeah.
And so I look at it with a little bit more of a fascination about me.
Yeah. Yeah,
it's just new. It's just different.
Well, just to go back to this article by Katie Brown, the point that she's making throughout this piece is that this HBCU band culture has a lot to offer to the classical music world, the so-called traditional classical music world, and the things that can be learned. So I picked out a few little excerpts from it here. One thing that Katie points out, she says, in this time of classical music reform, one of the main lessons we can learn from HBCU marching bands is the ability to maintain musical traditions while also responding to the surrounding culture. I think that's, of course, that $7 million question. How do you maintain traditions while engaging new audiences? But the point that she's making is that they're not just engaging new audiences or trying to do that, but really responding to the surrounding culture in a measurable way, in a way that you can actually hear. I wonder, why is that such a challenge on the classical music side? I suppose, I'll say that maybe it's easier for an HBCU band to arrange the latest track on the radio that all the black folks are listening to, and now you're just doing it. Of course, there's behind the scenes thing, rights and writing the publishers. I took that class in college. I know how all of that works. But at the end of the day, it just seems like classical music just refuses to let go of the tradition enough to actually do that, at least in a measurable way, in a very to the front way.
There's a few things that she points out that I thought was really interesting because it puts a finer point on some things that we've talked about. She says, only in the aftermath of racial reckoning of 2020 do we start to see regularly programmed works by canonic black composers outside of Black History Month. And if you look at the timeline of things, that's a pretty quick shift in a short span of time, in 2-ish years.
Yeah.
Okay, so there is some, for people like myself who've been announcing this music for 30 years, I feel a seismic shift.
I'm sure, of course.
But there's a different point that I wanted to bring up here near the bottom. She says something that I have talked about. No one is asking orchestras to completely abandon canonical repertoire, but an exclusive focus on tradition without engaging the local musical community is a disservice. I have heard her describe a good program as Jennifer Higdon, Hailstork, and Mahler 5.
Sure.
Okay, so that's something for everyone, right?
I sigh because we're okay leaving one style or ultimately one community completely in dust for the sake of tradition. But when it comes to acknowledging that community, the idea of exclusively and intentionally doing something is going too far. So, I'm not saying that finding balance is bad. It irks me to think about the fact that imbalance is only allowed to go one way and not the other. That's my point about it.
She points out here, sincere and valiant is the way she describes the effort that organizations need to use to learn more about the community around them, interacting with community members outside of special outreach concerts, learning what excites them about music, and extending invitations to attend regular season programming.
So let's say you are tasked with doing just that in the community where you live over on the east side of St. Paul. It's time to actually learn about these people. We aren't talking about a transactional relationship where we're offering you something to come hear this concert to be a thing. It's one way. You are learning about this community. What's your approach to that? Where do you go? Do you hang out? Sorry, I was going to say, do you hang out at the barbershop? I mean, you can. I mean, because you got a beard that deserves its time in the chair. I mean, or do you hang out at a restaurant, or is it the park when the weather is nicer? What do you consider of the spaces where the community is at and where you can learn from this?
Sure. In spring and summer months when it's nice and the windows are open, I can hear traditional Hmong music just pouring out of windows.
Like instruments and stuff.
Right. Not from a recording or anything. They're actually making the music there. And there's loads of people that do outdoor multi-people dance, traditional dance over there around Lake Phelan. And we also have a sister city garden with a Chinese pagoda. And it's really a beautiful setup that is people come there for photography in really elaborate traditional clothing. And I would start there.
That's something. So once the learning is happening, I think that next step, and maybe it's the step that the traditional classical music, Western classical music institutions can't quite grasp, is how to create relationships from that. Okay, so now we're learning that you exist, yeah, because really that's what, anyway, don't get me down that rabbit. But see, now you have me, because I think that's a part of the point. It's like, because we have this audience and these funders and whatever, it doesn't matter if they're there or not, because we have our thing. So I do think that's something of note to acknowledge these communities exist, and then now acknowledging that these communities have arts, have things that already exist there, because we talk about bringing the arts to these. Well, the arts are there. It's different, but they're there. So okay, so now that's step 2. I guess that step 3, that third base, is actually getting that engagement in, and that's where the difficulty can lie oftentimes. At least that's the evidence I see now these days.
The Twin Cities has, I believe it's still the case, the largest Hmong population outside of Laos.
Yeah.
And so there is a huge community to reach out to. And also on the east side, you have Somali and Latino communities
Right.
that, just loads of fertile
And
ground.
over here on the west side, of course,
course.
it's all of the Latine communities.
Right.
So anyway, I think that is a very important point that Katie is making here, that you have to actually not only acknowledge these communities, but make, as she say, a valiant effort to actually learn about them and engage them. Yeah.
So she points out here, it's rare to find a classical music institution that does tradition and revolution equally well. Do you think that's possible?
I definitely think it's possible.
What does it look like then?
I think it looks like a focus on the now and on the new, because wrapped inside of new, let's recenter these HBCU marching bands. Inside of the high kicks and the majorettes and the transcriptions of the hip hop songs and all of that stuff is the same 8-note scale that everyone else is the same technique, is the same foundational training. So, for me, I think it requires a reframing and a rethought of what we're considering the tradition, quote unquote. The tradition is in there. The musicianship is there. It's just being utilized in a different way. I think that can exist, but we have to relegate the performance of these instruments to an adherence to a very specific tradition rooted in one part of the world that has, spread across the world colonially and all that stuff, all that conversation. I think it is possible. There just has to be a divestment from the idea of tradition and how we're framing what the tradition is. I think my opinion is that the tradition is in the new. It's more foundational to the new than to the front, but it's still there.
So what do we do for the people that have a mostly white community to introduce them to this idea of HBCUs? How does that word get out?
Well, there's a lot of footage out there. We were talking about classical music movies last week, right? What's a good one? Maybe I mentioned it, I don't remember, but there is the film Drumline,
right?
And shout out to Nick Cannon.
Yeah.
That is, I feel like that is something that just showed that tradition to a broader audience, to a wider audience. But there's just also, I guess, mainly for people who live in the South, the ability for folks to go to the football game. Just to see what's going on. Where I'm from in Memphis, they have something called the Southern Heritage Classic. Is every year when Tennessee State University and Jackson State University, they meet in the middle in Memphis to have this football game. But really, the draw of that football game is not only the halftime show, but the fifth quarter, what they call the fifth quarter, which is after the game when you have the battle of the bands and all of those things.
Okay.
So the opportunities are there. I guess it's just about, I don't know, you don't have to market to those, to the communities that music comes from, because they just know. So I guess if is there really a need for that art to engage that broader audience? I think that's one of the foundational differences. When we talk about HBCU marching bands, we aren't talking about a relic. We aren't talking about something that's struggling, that's looking for broader audiences, or it's doing fine. Classical music doesn't quite have that privilege, and I think that's the difference in the conversation of how do we spread this thing? How do we get more people talking about it?
You mentioned Drumline. How accurate is it? I mean, that's going to be a late night, So if we're in the fifth quarter, is some major hip hop artist going to roll out in a Rolls?
It could happen. Oh yes, it could happen. That is definitely a thing, and that was the exciting thing about that film. It just gave a glimpse into that world. There's one more thing I want to make sure I highlight before we leave this accidental. Katie says here, and I quote, classical musicians can also turn to HBCU bands to learn the value of putting on a good show.
Is that wrong?
React. because
Nobody on this podcast ever said that HBCUs didn't put on a good show. One time.
I'm not looking for that, but I guess just the obviousness of it is that you have a good time at these shows, at these performances. You're on your feet. You react. It's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
The concert hall is so often not that. It's like we've said it all the time on this show. There is an education, sort of history, sort of learning factor to classical music that has to go away for, some of that more genuine engagement to happen. You don't have to come to the table of an HBCU marching band thinking about history or what you know or what you don't know. You react to the space and it's fun. That's not the case in a lot of orchestral spaces. Is there something to shifting that? Because, sometimes going to an art museum is fun, and an art museum is not a rock concert or whatever, but it has its place. So I wonder if that's just what we need to admit to ourselves when it comes to orchestral music. This isn't a space that was meant to be, clap your hands, stomp your feet. So sit down there and be quiet and clap when we tell you to. Is that just what we need to accept? I guess it's not. I guess it's fair to say that those spaces weren't built for that. But who's to say that it can't be that? Why can't we change it into that?
It was the Beethoven era that ushered in the sit down and be quiet and let this happen to you.
Mm-hmm. That Beethoven.
Because we talked about it just a few opuses ago. Prior to that, all sorts of things were going on during a concert.
Yeah, you could eat and pulling the curtain back.
You could get in a fight.
Yeah.
You could heckle.
Yeah, all kinds of
all
stuff.
That.
Yeah, well, maybe we can get back. Maybe we can meet in the middle, because I don't need somebody getting into a fight while I'm trying to listen to the whatever. One final thing I want to bring up, and this isn't really laid out in the article, but it just makes me think about when we think about HBCU style bands, there are still plenty of core style bands. Drum Corps International, DCI is still a major industry.
Mm-hmm.
So that style of outside music is also not going anywhere. I think when we talk about the evolution of concert spaces, does it just boil down to those cultural lines? Is it that we need to be more comfortable acknowledging that there are certain communities who are interested in this and they're going to come over here? There are other communities that are interested in another thing, and if they're just separate but equal, so be it. It's kind of a grim thing to sort of accept. It's not that I want the core style to go away, but it seems like there has to be some use of the arts bridging communities instead of reinforcing cultural divides.
I think that is a place where they can really play that role well, because don't we already have the places that we go to be around the members of our community?
Yeah.
I mean, don't we have the places where we, you talked about feeling at Gigi's, you talked about having that feeling of coziness.
Mm-hmm.
Now I realize there was nobody in there with you, but would that have changed if there was a healthy bustle?
I think it would have, and maybe
okay.
Maybe I wouldn't have enjoyed the experience as much if it was. I certainly wouldn't have if it was shoulder to shoulder and I'm wading through a space, and so I don't know.
Basically, what I'm saying is I think that arts organizations are in a unique position to be a uniting presence rather than a separating one.
Well, let's get to it. And shout out to Katie Brown again for this brilliant article from icareifyoulisten.com. At the very beginning of the article, Katie talks about sort of her foray into this idea of HBCU marching bands, a performance by Southern University of a composition titled Can You Stand the Rain, one of those classic works by New Edition, a transcription of it anyway. So we're going to transition into our next accidental by listening to a little bit of that performance. Can You Stand the Rain by New Edition, as performed by the Southern University Human Jukebox. This is from 2014. Shout out to them. You know, we talk about music education. So this performance took place in 2014. College freshmen, sophomores in 2014 in this band were born 1996, 1997. So New Edition is not a part of their, growing up. That's not what happened. And at the same time, they know the music, maybe their parents or uncles or whatever exposed them to it, but they're learning it in college as well. You see, they are getting a music education. I think it's important to note that, because when we talk about music history and those sorts of things, it's so easy to just automatically jump way back to Bach and motets and all of that stuff. But that's music education as well. Does it not warm your heart to know that some youngling somewhere is as familiar with the music that you were doing the Running Man to as you are?
99 Problems, right, making its way into bluegrass. Sure.
Anyway, shout out to Katie Brown. Very, very incredible article. All right, we got one more accidental. Scott, you put this one on my radar. What accidental do you want to give this?
I'm giving this a sharp 2.
Sharp? All right. What we got here?
apu.edu is where you'll find the article. The title is Karen Hall, Reimagining Classical Music Through Clowning. You know Karen Hall. Yeah,
I had the pleasure of performing with Karen a few times out in Los Angeles. If I'm remembering correctly, we were both in the pre-professional orchestra, the American Youth Symphony, but I know for a fact that we met on the set of Glee. She was among the other musicians who magically appear, into a scene when a song begins. So yeah, it's cool to see Karen's profile and light shining here.
She mentions that in the article that I think it said something like she had the most hours on screen as a backing musician. So congratulations for that. But that helped her to get more gigs, and she started doing improv. And she was looking for a way to, I guess creating relationships is sort of the theme of this opus, because she was looking for ways to connect with the audience. And through improv, she got into clowning. And the way that she uses it, now once you said after you left APM, when you were terminated from APM, that there were people on Reddit saying that you were playing hip hop. You said they really thought I was clowning.
Especially down in Texas. By the time the story got down there, they really thought I was playing rap. And I was like, I mean, anyway, water under the bridge. Go on.
Okay, but clowning, right? Yeah. Okay, so for those not in the vernacular,
right? So being ridiculous, really, just throwing convention out the window and just doing something.
So the article starts with this descriptor of what you might expect. You're going to go and you're going to hear some Bach cello music, right? And the lights dim and everybody falls quiet, and the cellist comes out, and before playing the music, eats a sandwich. Slowly, start to finish, with everybody
just looking out,
right?
Into the
and maybe stopping for a minute, like, ooh,
and doing that whole thing, and then playing the cello,
and does both well. She eats the sandwich well, and she plays the cello well. Your reaction, your feedback, if you were in the audience for that performance,
I think if I knew something crazy would happen, I would just sit there and so this is the clowning.
Eating a sandwich is crazy.
I mean, sitting on stage and eating one as what we're here to be entertained by. I think that counts as clowning. But if I did not know that was happening, I feel like I would just be staring and really trying to figure out for a minute. Okay. So this is a part of the show, or what? I think you would be just in that range of disbelief and wonder and confusion. You would just do that.
Is it too risky? Do you think it's too risky as a choice?
Too risky to do something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the risk? An audience member walking out or something? I mean,
or
they bought the ticket at that point.
Perhaps, right. Or perhaps they don't take you seriously.
I see what you're saying. I guess there is that risk, but I don't know. What do you see as the point of this? It's not just shtick. There is something behind this clowning that Karen Hall is doing.
Hmm. Yeah, she was talking about the way that the clown is like the genuine, honest reaction to the stimulus around you,
Hmm.
and the clown, you encourage them, do more, go crazier, be sillier.
So it's about
You know,
audience interaction and making those connections.
Right. The one thing that I wondered about, because Victor Borge did it. You know Victor Borge, right?
No.
Okay. Well, here go the liver spots showing up on my hands again. Victor Borge was a pianist that played beautifully. He was a concert level pianist, but he built in real comedic elements.
Oh, sure.
To his performances, and I wonder if there is a risk of getting that label.
Mhm.
That you're not a serious musician. You have you have clowning with your compositions.
Yep. Well, I mean, I think let's talk about icebreakers. Let's talking about taking the stuffiness out of a space. It really does that. And by the time you get done watching Karen eat the sandwich or whatever she does that's in this clowning, and she plays the Bach cello suites or whatever she's playing, I think the air is so unheavy that maybe there's more room to actually enjoy what you're listening to and enjoying the personality behind these notes instead of sitting there silently in a more conventional way. I think there's some magic to this sort of approach.
The reason why I ask that is because the article says, as a highly skilled musician, Hall has persevered through the physical and mental tolls
Yeah.
that come from a demanding career.
It'll wear you
Now,
down.
right? Okay, so now you add this element to it. That's
Mhm.
I would think that in a lot of circles, people would see that as a risk.
Yeah.
Perhaps not you or I, but somebody else would go, I'd like it if she just played.
I mean,
You know what I'm saying?
yeah, but I guess it's hard for me to really understand how to react to the idea of this being quote unquote risky, because if person A, who is there to only hear Bach cello suites in the most conventional way, if that's who you're censoring, there are other people whose opinions you don't care about, which means they don't take you seriously. You know, they're not. No, I didn't mean to hit the applause. I'm applauding myself. No. So I think there's that. So you can talk about risk of losing this audience, but you, if word about this gets out, which it
right,
has, you'll get a different audience. So there's no risk. There's reward.
There's room for it. There's
Yeah.
room for it. Sort of. It reminds me of something that Steve Martin might do. That you have to be patient, and you
Sure.
have to go through it, because at the end there's usually this big payoff, right? One of the other things that I love about what she is doing is, in response to her struggles with mental health, she founded the Musician Health Resource.
Yeah.
And this is a company intended to help musicians as they work through internal and external struggles. Man, if you have somebody that understands the struggle that you can talk to,
and someone who you aren't also in competition with. See,
Ugh.
Karen is in a place in her career where she has found what she's doing. So folks on the audition circuit or folks trying to form their career or X, Y, and Z, she can, and not that she wouldn't, I'm not saying that, but there's just a difference between having dialogue, having that interaction with someone who doesn't have anything to lose or gain by giving you advice or spending time
Yeah.
with you. I think there's magic to that. And to, kind of pull on that thread a little bit, I like something that she says in here. She says it's the balance of making sure the audience is happy. Again, talking about the clowning, it's this balance of making sure the audience is happy, but making sure you're not surrendering your joy either. I think that has been one of my struggles over the course of my career in classical music. One of the reasons I left the orchestral stage, it was like, okay, the audience is liking this. I'm doing this for an audience, but I am, am I selling my values or my beliefs or what I really believe
Yeah.
in? Especially in radio. Listen, you brought up APM. Yes, I was switching up that playlist. I was not playing rap. Maybe I should
That
have.
was so hilarious.
But it just got to a point where I was embarrassed. I couldn't stand behind the way that, some of the playlists look. Who am I, this black activist in classical music and so-called agitator trying to change things up, and I'm sitting here, talking for 30 seconds about Boccherini and or even Brahms or these folks, every hour, day after day. It just didn't feel right. And I think, reading that can affirm so many other people. It's like in classical music, we spent so much time, we invest in it so fully and so early in our lives. We're 10, 11, 12 years old, really dedicated to this thing, and that lasts and that lasts. And sometimes I think it's easy to forget that you got to have fun too. You can't just be a martyr to this thing because someone else likes it. And I really appreciate that Karen is acknowledging that and digging into that here.
Digging back to what Katie said in the previous accidental, it's rare to find classical music institutions who do tradition and revolution equally well. So perhaps Karen is going to be the one to show us the way, or to revive that tradition of adding some irreverence to clowning in classical music. I should say clowning.
But, to circle back to, one of those earlier points, you got to have the chops. If you're up there eating the sandwich and then you start playing the cello and you sound like shit, that's not, that's the risk. That's when folks are going to start, throwing stuff at you or walking out the room. So it's not that this is something that Karen has just fallen back into. She has done the work. She has spent the blood, sweat, and tears in the practice room, just like all these other cellists. And she has found a way to engage different audiences, broader audiences, and to touch people's personalities, touch people's human experience, and not only their knowledge of Bach and their engagement of that, artificial or otherwise. I think this is great, and I hope she continues. Take the show on tour.
Yeah, she said she's developing her show called Delusions and Grandeur.
Something that many of us have, delusions of grandeur, right? Anyway. Shout out to Karen Hall. Congratulations to you. And go check out that article from, apu.edu. All right, well, we're going to listen to Karen Hall play a little bit of one of these Bach cello suites as we get into the second movement here, among the most traditional of all the music, performed here by Karen Hall. This is what I'm going to say about that conversation of balance programs and things. I listened to this, the prelude from this cello suite, and there are contexts under which it is kind of refreshing, even, in my radio days, to have that come across the playlist, or even for me to program it for some reason. It can be a nice palate cleanser or a nice reminder or something. So there is a place for it, but I just don't think it should be centered. We spend too much time with music like that, so close to the center of what we do in our perspectives. That's when the balance conversation is something that I push back on, because if we're gonna be okay with imbalance, we have to be okay with imbalance over on the other side. As that's just the point I make there. But it's a nice piece of music. I'm sure you can spin a yarn about it when you need to,
and
even as famous of a piece as it is. There's a place for it, and even I can say, I can enjoy it in the right context.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, but we're here in the second movement. We're not going to be talking about any Bach, but we are going to talk a little bit about some of the music that we've been spending some time with since we spoke with y'all last. So you'll go first this week, Scott. What do you have?
Well, we passed Veterans Day since the last Opus, and we didn't really touch on it last week. So a belated.
I didn't know what was coming.
Right.
I called the bank on Thursday and they said, "Oh, well, you better do this today because we're going to be closed tomorrow." So I'm like, "Oh, well, I'm not off work. So what's going on?" But it's for the veterans, you know?
That's right. Initially, it was Armistice Day. Now Armistice Day is specifically for the veterans of World War I. And then in 1954, I believe it became Veterans Day, just remembering all veterans. And my father is a vet. Both of my brothers served. So the military was a palpable presence in my growing up. And I'm curious, your father was in the Air Force, correct?
Both of my parents were in the Air Force, and most of my uncles and aunts and
have they shared stories?
My sister was in, and yeah.
Do they share stories with you?
Sure. I mean, as far as not war stories. I don't know if my parents were ever in battle or anything, but yeah, they're the stories of seeing the world. You know, the story of how they met is tied to the military, and yeah. Sure.
I got some of the Vietnam era stuff from my father.
I see.
And a little bit of Desert Storm from my brother. But the piece of music I wanted to bring in does pay respects to the veterans. It's written by James Lee III, and it's called A Different Soldier's Tale. And it's all loosely based on stories that his grandfather handed down, that his grandfather would share. And I can't tell you how many times I've thought of, I should be recording my father's stories. I have all this recording gear. And he starts spinning a yarn, and I just think, wow, that's a great story. And it's off in the ether. You know, so I think it's great that James took some of those stories and made a piece of music out of it to sort of keep them and reiterate them. But some of them are chilling in that, you know, the inspiration is being on night patrol. Another movement talks about, you know, fear of Nazi execution. And there's moments where it is very calm, but I mean, this is just a pulsating piece of music that creates a little bit of disorientation. It doesn't affect, it creates just a little bit of an off my balance sort of a feeling, particularly in the fourth movement.
You know, that's the type of piece that I would describe as angular. Like, I love the angles of the piece. It's very exciting. That opening there definitely grabs your attention. It's called Celebration of Broad Street, you know, I guess there's some sort of celebration of it, but as you said, it's like an off-kiltered sort of sound Yeah,
he said that that movement was part of the victory celebration, returning home to Selma. I believe that was the movement, but it feels like it's really horn heavy, right? And it sort of felt like there was an echo coming off the stadium wall, maybe.
Sure.
You know, you get that?
Yeah.
And he created that in the music, right? That's not a recording trick, is it?
I mean, I wasn't there, but there's definitely ways to do that.
You would know more than I.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a cool aesthetic. Yeah,
and I think it's a great way to immortalize the stories of his grandfather. What a great way to do it! And I'm also going to have to look up to see whether or not James went to an HBCU. Maybe he's got a big brass background.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, I've definitely aired lots of music by James Lee III. He's had music performed by the Gateways Music Festival, so you know he's definitely in the mix and doing some really incredible things here in music.
Does he have a specialty, or is that pretty representative of what he composes?
It's interesting that you ask that, because piece of music falls outside of what I typically think of when it comes to his aesthetic. So I think it just shows the diversity of his tactics and his writing pen. So shout out to James Lee III. That's a really cool piece of music, and shout out to Marin Alsop who led that performance.
And shout out to the veterans. Appreciate you.
Absolutely. Well, for my second movement this week, I'm going to go to the music of Shawn Okpebholo. So, like I said, I was in New York last week, and shout out to Caesar. Caesar keeps me up late. He'll show me a score and get excited about, a piece of music that a lot of folks don't know. We were up late last night listening to and following along the score of a piece by Berlioz, The Death of Cleopatra.
Oh yeah.
You know that one? See,
that's
I
didn't know soprano.
Right, I think it's a mezzo. Right. Anyway, so we are up doing a lot of that. Well, at one point he's like, "Okay, well, you show me something. You educate me now." So I wasn't, I had to think about it for a while, and again, it was midterm week. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but one of the news stories that kind of got brushed over or not focused on was the fact that there were Black churches across the state of Mississippi burned down last week. This anti-Black terrorism is still very much alive. So that's in the back of my mind. And of course, I'm thinking about new composers. I'm doing some collaborations right now with Shawn Okpebholo. So he was on my mind. And I remembered, one of these works that he wrote. It's called Two Black Churches. So it's music that, of course, shines a light back on the civil rights era and the tragic church bombings in Birmingham where little girls died, So he takes that bit of history, his own unique contemporary perspective on art song, and he creates something really incredible. This performance, we're going to listen to just a little bit of the first movement. It's called Ballad of Birmingham, and it's performed by a member of the TRILLOQUY family, Will Liverman, and we have Paul Sanchez here on the piano. A little bit of the opening of the Ballad of Birmingham from Two Black Churches by Shawn Okpebholo.
Instead of out to play, and march the streets of Birmingham in a freedom march, freedom march.
There's so many layers to the music, in the piano opening, you can hear the glimpses of the church sound, the blues, the sort of chords that are really reminiscent of that, but it's just sprinkled with other sounds that I think point to not only just a more contemporary aesthetic of music, but something menacing or
Yeah.
something just around the corner. As we heard in those opening lyrics, as performed by Will Liverman, we have a little child asking her mother, "Can I want to go march with the people? Let me go out there." The mother thinks it's too dangerous. Sends the girl to church instead, and then of course, we know what happens next. The church is bombed. So it's we were talking about refuge at the beginning of this opus, and how sometimes those places of refuge can be danger. If I want to apply that to classical music spaces generally, we can think of a concert hall as being a refuge, a safe space, a neutral space, but it's been a traumatizing space for so many people. It can in many ways continue to be a very colonial space. Anyway, there's so many things I think that I can unpack out of that music, and I just love listening to it and thinking about the evolution specifically of art song to really engage conversations and be this really contemporary art thing. So shout out to Shawn Okpebholo and all of the performers involved in that recording of Two Black Churches. It comes from the album Dreams of a New Day that we actually featured when Will Liverman was on TRILLOQUY. So really, really glad to have that here. What's your ideas relationship as a broadcaster with art song generally? Do you do you put vocal music in a category of works that may be able to engage audiences a little more effectively or directly? It's one thing to write a break about this piece of music that represents X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Maybe it's more direct for audiences to hear music where they hear words that are speaking to a specific thing. And I'm not talking about European art song that's not sung in English. I'm talking about contemporary music with English lyrics, with subject matter that is not only understood but experienced by many people.
I did talk about that just a few days ago, how folk music built into a composition is a way for a composer to build rapport with their audience, because if you hear something that you recognize from your childhood, you perk up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or something that means something to your culture or your homeland. So and if it's in your language and it's speaking to your experience, it's a great way to connect. I
know and understand that is not really the tradition for classical, especially classical broadcasts, to center vocal music. That's the medium for orchestral music and chamber music and all of those sorts of things. But as maybe about a month ago when I was talking about I went to a choir concert, and it sort of got me back into paying attention to that and having a love and respect for that. I think there is something to reconsidering the power of art song as a means of engaging new audiences, not too far away from the tradition, but far away enough to engage someone in a different way. Again, like I said, there's a lot of really incredible music out there that represents certain things, that musically speaks to certain things. If the lyrics and the aesthetics can really directly connect to those folks, there's something to that and something to be paid attention to. So shout out to Shawn Okpebholo again and all of those performers. But we're going to go ahead and get into the third movement. As I mentioned earlier, Elijah Daniel Smith comes back for part 2 of our conversation. Elijah Daniel Smith is a young composer whose star is rising, has recently received all sorts of awards and recognition, and it's just a pleasure for me to get to sit down and engage with him. So we continue with the composer talk this week, but we get into acknowledging the diversity of Blackness, especially as a composer, and we start here with the challenge of affirming one's art as a composer with confidence. Scott, when you are a composer and you're standing in front of these orchestras and in front of all these people who are grumpy or whatever, they just ready for the lunch break, and you're asking them to play the F sharp a little softer or whatever, there takes a certain level of confidence to really address and engage a body of musicians in that way. So that's where Elijah and I get started. I'm going to transition us into this conversation with a composition of his titled Animus. It features soprano saxophone, and it sounds like electronics or some sort of technology. It's a really cool piece of music here. Joseph Connor is the soprano saxophonist in this performance of Animus by Elijah Daniel Smith. Hope y'all enjoy this as we get into our conversation.
Sometimes if you're working with a more established ensemble or musicians and they make kind of careless mistakes, either they didn't read, practice enough and they don't read the rhythms right, it can be really uncomfortable correcting them, especially if they're significantly older and they're more established in the industry. It can be really tough to, for me as a mid-20s person to look at them and be like, that's wrong. Obviously, like, I'm not going to say it like that, but it's just like, it can be really uncomfortable to say like that, those pictures aren't correct. And, so that's something that I think for me is going to be a lifelong struggle, to find that balance of being direct and saying like, that isn't what I want. And also finding a way to say like, I don't need to voice this as a, I'm right, you're wrong. And how can I best, get this note out here in a way that makes people feel comfortable in the environment. So working with an orchestra can definitely help, because like, sometimes those comments got to be made so quickly that you just say it exactly how it comes out the first time, and that's that. And thankfully, a lot of the musicians know like it's not a personal thing. Maybe they said that a bit like an asshole, but like it's because we're on a time crunch, and I guess we got to get it out there. So I think at least maybe it's just because of my age, I feel a little tentative to really come out and be like, these things are wrong, and maybe that'll come with a little more experience. But I think it's important for composers to, if something isn't correct and you have the time to correct it, to not be shy. Don't be a dick about it, but don't be shy in saying like, these things need to be correct, because they want to play it correctly too, So.
Right. But it has to be more than just age, though, because I'm thinking about, let's say we had Sheku Kani Mason. He wrote a piece of music and he's with the New York Philharmonic or with the London Phil or whatever. They're going to listen to him, and he's young as well. So, I mean, is it, when considering age as one of those factors of these power dynamics, do we also have to think about fame, or what do you think the other ingredients are in there?
I definitely think fame is a big part of it, whether or not, and like if talking to a lot of my friends are orchestral musicians, and, they talk a lot about like the experience of working with conductors. And, a lot of the time, if that element of like personal and professional respect for that conductor isn't there, even outside of their conducting abilities, it might create a different dynamic working with that person. And I think for composers, it's very similar. Like, even if it doesn't, like, even if I write something amazing, if they have no idea who I am, they're not going to be hostile towards me, but there's definitely going to be a little more tentativeness on their part in listening to what I have to say, as though I do know what I'm talking about. And I don't think it's a conscious thing of like, I don't know this person, they need to prove themselves to me. But I do think there often is, especially because there are a lot of composers out there who are, a bit off the rocker, and they come in, they say wild shit, and the ensemble's like, oh, okay, here we go. So I think there is often that tentativeness of like, what kind of person are you going to be dealing with here? And so for someone, like Mason, who's a very established musician, like it's a lot easier. Not a lot easier, but I'm sure that there's an element there of like, we know who this person is. We know what's going to happen here, and we know that we can listen to this person and respect their opinion, and they know what they're talking about, as opposed to someone like me who's like, who the fuck are you? Like, I you know what I mean? So
yeah, the chaos demon in me loves the idea of a composer going off in front of an orchestra. I'll be there rooting on the composer, but relationships are important, and what people say about you can be more important than what they thought of your music or that sort of thing. So I understand all of the different variables, and again, I'm thinking about these spaces where, new music, the idea of new music has taken on an aesthetic of its own. As much as we talk about the experience of the composer and the experience of composer to orchestra, we also have to talk about audience. If we don't have an audience, who are we doing this for? What are we doing this for? Do you think new music as a community, as you've said, is aesthetically moving in the correct direction to develop audiences that look a little different than they have in the past? I imagine that a lot of the things that you've written can be just as unfamiliar or challenging to an audience member as a piece by Beethoven or Schubert.
Probably more so for me. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it is moving in the right direction. I think that process has been accelerated because of all that's happened in the last 3 years. And, I think obviously the pandemic forced people to make music in a different way. And I think that there are some elements of that are being carried through. I think there's a strong desire to revert back to what things were before the pandemic, because people were, a lot of the time pretty dissatisfied with the experience of listening to virtual music, and fairly so. So I think there are a lot of people who do kind of want to just go back to what things were. But at the same time, I think there are just as many people who are saying, like, well, wait, we discovered all these new cool things that we could do with digital means. Why are we just ignoring that? Why are we, throwing that out? And then also, of course, with all the social unrest that there's been in the last couple of years, the long overdue social unrest. I think there are a lot of organizations who are now finally getting on board the equity train and recognizing that, like, oh shit, we have a lot of work to do. And so I think their efforts are manifesting in different ways. And a lot of those efforts are being manifested in having a more diverse programming approach, or maybe having certain events that are, tailored towards a certain demographic, or like, hey, like, we're having cheaper tickets for this for, whatever reason, like whether or not these are the right approach. I think the intention is in the right place. And I think that so long as people keep an open mind and people are willing to receive criticism on these efforts, then we'll probably get to where we want to be. Because I think the second people are like, well, I don't know, we had a fucking night for Black people. Like, what else do we need? Like, we did it. Like, there it is. Like the second we have that mentality, we're right back to where we were 10 years ago. But hopefully that won't be the case anymore.
Yeah, what I wish more institutions would realize and understand is that it's not necessarily money that's keeping certain communities out of the space. The example I always bring up is that as soon as Beyonce announces her American tour, we're going to pay the thousands of dollars. We are going to figure it out. That's not what we're doing for the concert space. I'll connect this conversation to what we were talking about earlier with program notes. You said that, there are folks out there who will use as big of words as they can and speak over the audience's head, as opposed to folks who will write program notes directly to audiences to make sure that they can understand. I wonder how you engage that musically. I'm sure there are pressures, especially, as someone going after a PhD right now, pressures to, have things as complex or nuanced as possible musically. But there are also folks who just want to hear a pretty song, as they may say. How do you balance those two things as a composer?
Yeah, I mean, I personally speaking, I don't think there's anything wrong with people saying, I just want to go hear a pretty song. I also know, I don't think there's anything wrong with me saying, like, I'm not the fucking person to do that for you. Like,
my songs are not pretty.
It's like, there might be a pretty chord in there here and there, but like, you got to wait 20 minutes for that one. So buckle up. I mean, I'm totally kidding, but like, I'm partially kidding. But I think every composer needs to be honest with himself about what they're writing. I think the second you start trying to tailor things to a specific audience or specific group of people because you think they'll like that more is a really good way to start relying on what you know to be successful already. And I think that'll just stagnate you, because
if not just stereotypes.
Exactly. Yeah. Rely on tropes and rely on things like, oh, these people like this before, I'll do it again. So it's just like,
Yeah.
I think I think composers need to be honest with themselves and ask, every time I write a piece, I have to ask myself, like, why am I writing this particular piece? And what is it that I'm trying to do with this? And, you know, it's important to have the understanding that not every piece of music is going to be for everybody.
Yeah.
And that's okay. If you're writing music to exclude people, that's not okay. But if you're writing music that is honest to you and it's something you're really interested in, then there's nothing wrong with saying, like, yeah, these, a lot of people aren't going to like this, but I really do. And the people I'm making the music with really like it. And that's enough. So I think the balance there can be difficult, especially when it comes to inviting people in when you know that you wrote a piece that's kind of just for you. But I think maybe thus far I've been really fortunate and lucky to have written some pieces that are simultaneously personal to me and something that I really like that other people seem to like as well. I've just been lucky there. And maybe that won't always be the case, but I think the second you, as a composer, maybe not the second, but I think if as a composer you start really trying to, like, sell shit and be like, oh, this will really work again, that's a different reason for writing music. And there's nothing wrong with that, saying, like, I want to make money off the music that I'm writing. But I think for me that would be a very different approach, and I think that is kind of not really where new music TM, as you said, has been for a long time. So
sure. I think that's a great way of looking at that. I want to go back to something you said regarding equity and equity initiatives. A lot of institutions, organizations are getting on that train and working toward doing the right thing as they see it. But not all people see the right thing, the so-called right thing, as good. For example, the call for scores for which you participated and got a commission was completely open. There weren't demographic based criteria. With that said, those demographic based criteria calls for scores do exist. As we're recording this, we're in the midst of a partnership with ACO. I am with an orchestra who is looking at scores by women. There's another orchestra who is exclusively considering scores by Black and brown composers. From your view, from your perspective, why is that a good thing? Or maybe I'll frame the question as, what would be your reaction to the person who says that is racist or that is wrong? Because I'm sure that's a part of the narrative that comes with equity aligned initiatives.
Yeah. I mean, I think a really good quote, I don't know who it's from, basically said that when you've been in a position of power, equality can often seem like oppression.
Right.
When you've had the power and, like, when you've been the beneficiary of inequities, when you start to level that playing field, all of a sudden it feels like people are taking things from you, and in reality they're just giving the shit that you shouldn't have had to begin with and distributing it a little more evenly. And so I think for these initiatives that are, maybe focused on, like, for these orchestras who are only looking at works by female composers, it's like, if you have a problem with, like, firstly, a lot of the people who complain about that shit are people who don't have any pieces to submit anyway. So it's like, why do you care? It's okay. Like, it doesn't affect you, but it's like, those things are the smallest possible thing that we could do to make up for centuries of deliberately keeping these people out. Mm-hmm. And if creating a new opportunity for these people is offensive to other people, then it's like, it's clearly not about the opportunity itself. It's about the fact that you feel as though you're being excluded from something that, honestly, you've been excluding people from, maybe not them personally, but, like, it's like, come on. Like, if you really have a problem with these people getting opportunities, then it's not really about the opportunities that they're getting. It's that you have a problem with them being put in the spotlight, and you have a problem with the changing demographic of what this world is.
And what adds a level of complication to it is that you have the naysayers, or the people who are critical of equity aligned initiatives, and then you have the folks who are aligned with equity, but are problematic on that side of things. For example, thinking of Blackness as one thing, looking for Black scores when you're really looking for scores that incorporate hip hop or gospel, because you approximate those things. considering the way that your blackness is expressed and the way that diversity within blackness is expressed through your history, as a screamo rock guitarist and that sort of thing. Do you feel like the industry is ready to engage the fact that being black is not one thing, being black is many things?
I don't know if they're ready to engage with it. I don't know if they're aware of it to begin with. I think that a lot of, and not everyone, obviously, like a lot of people, thankfully, especially, the people that we work with, thankfully, are very aware of that and, give people the appropriate platforms to express these things. But I think a lot of people still think of like, oh, like, I mean, it's tokenization is like what it really is a lot of the time. I think a lot of these organizations who think of promoting music by Black composers see it as like, well, Black composers, as you said, like that means like hip hop and rap, right? And it's just like and so like when they want to commission a Black composer, what they're really thinking is like, we want drums and like rhythms, you know what I mean? Like, and it's just like
or swing,
exactly. It's like you play jazz, right? Like you like jazz, Black. So I think a lot of people definitely have that mentality, subconsciously, maybe consciously. And they're unaware of the fact that being Black means whatever it, any individual Black person wants it to mean to them. And I think a lot of people do have the expectation for composers of color, not just Black composers, but composers of color in general, that our music is going to focus on our race and that is our contribution to music. That's all we have to give is like, and a small thing that I often try to do is like, as much as I can, rather than being like, oh, he's a Black composer, or she's a Black composer, they're a Black composer, like they're a composer who happens to be Black. Like they don't have to, their racial identity doesn't have to be the sole focus of their music unless they want it to be. And in that case, by all means, go for it. It's your identity and you can do whatever you want with it. But I think the expectation from composers of color that our music is going to be about being a composer of color can be just as harmful as saying like, oh, like we don't want you to talk about that, because at that point in time you're boiling an individual down to one demographic that might be an important demographic to them, but if you're telling them that they have to talk about it on terms that aren't their own, then you're putting them in just as uncomfortable position as if you were to tell them you can't talk about it.
So as a Black person who is multiracial, are there aspects of this conversation that don't come to the front? We talk about the Black experience all the time when we, get to talking about equity initiatives and that sort of thing. Are there aspects of the multiracial experience that we're missing out on or not bringing to the front or not acknowledging?
I'm sure there are. I think one of the biggest problems with it is that the experience of, a multiracial person is so unbelievably nuanced, as it is with all, people who are, monoracial. Like it's still incredibly nuanced all the time, but like obviously I'm very light skinned. But there are a lot of people who are biracial, half Black, half white, who aren't as light skinned, and they live a different experience as a biracial person as I have, because I do think colorism is a huge part in that. And, I think, especially along these lines, it's like one thing that I have noticed being as light skinned as I am is that people are a little more weary of what they would, or people a little less inclined to really believe that I'm Black in some capacity. And the number of times growing up that I've heard like, well, you're not that Black, especially when it's like when I was playing in metal bands and shit like that, things that are stereotypically white, people are like, oh, well, you like metal and shit like that. Black people don't like metal. Like, you're not Black. So it's like, there's definitely an element there of like, I think my actions as a biracial person have to somehow fulfill their stereotypical idea of what a Black person is in order for them to consider me Black. And so I think that's a really difficult thing to bring into music. I don't know how I would do that. There's a movie called Green Book that I think definitely has its problems, but there's a really, for those who don't know it, it's a movie about a Black concert pianist who's touring the South, and he has a white driver to sort of, be his bodyguard. And there's a moment in the movie that like really spoke to me, and I was on a plane, and like, I don't like cry during movies very much. Like I usually, but like there's a moment where the driver who's white looks at the Black pianist like, you don't know Little Richard? I love Little Richard, and I know more about your music than you do, so I'm Blacker than you are. And like after that, the pianist, what he says, he's like, if I'm not Black enough and if I'm not white enough, then what am I? And like that shit really stuck with me for a while, because I think that really speaks to the experience of a lot of biracial people, where it's just like we aren't clearly one thing, and being both of those things often isn't an option because people don't really know what that is. People don't know what that looks like, and people have to say like, are you Black or not? So I think bringing that into the new music world, I think it's, for me at least, I don't know how I would talk about that just yet, because I think I'm still in the process of figuring it out. But I think there needs to be the understanding again that people's racial identities are complex and nuanced. And if you want them to talk about that, it has to be of their own volition. And they have to be given the space to talk about it however they want to talk about it, because it's going to look different for them as it would for someone else. So I think maybe just leaving it there is like, if you want to talk about this, you can. You don't have to, though. So I don't know.
As you continue to develop your engagement with this conversation, do you see it as an obligation or something that you're just working on? Let's take it back to music. You know, as a composer, do you feel obliged to make this a part of your process or delivery or presentation?
I don't. I'm sure a lot of people do feel that, because there's a lot of pressure on that right now. And for like, you know, I think a lot of, you know, for lack of a better term, or like, not to be too blunt about it, but there's a lot of opportunity out here nowadays for composers of color that wasn't here a few years ago. So I think it can be really enticing to say like, well, look, there are all these opportunities for people of color, and I'm a person of color, so I'm really going to hype that shit up because it's going to help me get this. And like, I totally get it. But at the same time, for me, I would feel as though I'm pandering to, if I changed the way I interact with or the way I understand my own race to get something out of it. I would feel like that would be, you know, I would be misrepresenting who I am in a way that I think would be disgustingly dishonest. And it would be, I think my music would be way worse because I'd be trying to do something that isn't honest to me. I think the way I present myself to people would be really uncomfortable, because it's just like people who know me would be like, let's not fucking do that. Come on. So it's like, I think for anyone who's in the position of like trying to figure out like what to do with your race, you know, in music, again, I'd say just be honest with, yourself about who you are. And if it happens that your race is the central focus of your life, that's totally fine. Can do it. But if it's not, don't feel like you have to put it out there because that's what people want from you nowadays. Even if it is what they want from you, don't fucking give it to them. Do with it what you will.
Yep. I'll throw one more question on this topic to you, but before I do that, how can folks learn more about you, catch up on some upcoming performances, and just learn more about what you do?
Yeah. My website is ElijahDanielSmith.com.
Your full government.
My full government right there. My social security is up there. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I usually just post any updates and stuff on there. I've got my SoundCloud link to that, so you can listen to my music on my website and all that sort of stuff. My Instagram is just Elijah Daniel Smith. I don't really post much on there, but I think if there's, I'm not super engaged with social media. I'm definitely one of the people who just scrolls and likes and doesn't post very much. So I don't know. The most that you'll find about me is all on there, and I'll probably run into folks and have conversations. But
yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. So to tie a bow on this, and again, returning to this nuanced conversation of race, we can spend all day talking about what white people who are not people of color, what they're doing wrong and how they need to shift and those sorts of things. I think some of the more difficult conversations is how people of color need to shift to acknowledge more of our diversity. I wonder if you have a charge specifically to Black people who are not multiracial when it comes to celebrating and acknowledging our diversity as it manifests in food, in music, in fashion, in anything.
Oh man, I don't know if I'd call it a charge, but
yeah, this is what's going to get you in trouble. Go for it.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, whoa. I would say that a really important thing is, again, letting each individual person of color define what their racial identity is for themselves and what it means for them. Let Black people define their own Blackness and let it be what it is. I think and this, definitely isn't everyone, obviously. And it's probably a minority community within our minority community. But people who do have this expectation of like, if you're Black, you have to speak for the whole community all the time. And I think that that can be a lot of pressure for anyone. And I think that sometimes you just got to let people do what they want to do, regardless. You know, if they want to do something that you think is kind of weird, or like, you know, like, oh, Black people don't do that shit. Like, you know, who gives a shit? Black people don't do that shit yet because we probably haven't been allowed to do it yet. That's probably why. So it's like, if someone got an interest in that, then let them do it and support them in it and support their interests. And, you know, I think another thing like this for me is, you know, when I was growing up, like the sport that I played the most was hockey, ice hockey. And, you know, people are like, I can't fucking play hockey. And it's like, yeah, because we haven't fucking been allowed to, and because it's expensive, and those means haven't been there. So it's like, if someone has these sorts of interests, you know, let them do it and support them in it, and let them bring their own racial experience into it if they want to. And if they don't want to, that's fine.
By Elijah called Shifting Ground. Is performed there by Sandbox Percussion. It's something to me that there are so many, I'm thinking about specifically Sandbox Percussion, so many musicians out here just living their best life, playing contemporary music, not getting into arguments about folks about balanced programming and all of that stuff. And I think it really comes through in the music. Even considering that this is just percussion music that we were listening to. It's not as tonal or anything as a vocal piece. For me, anyway, there's a part of the fun and the lightness that I still hear in it. You know, just four guys banging on stuff and seeing how it all lines up. I think that's fun, and it's great that Elijah is, you know, writing for percussion as well. I think that's really cool. One of the things, you know, that we ended the conversation with, one of the things we were talking about is the diversity of Black thought and the Black experience in classical music, and the fact that if there are some people who want to put that to the front, that's great. If there are some Black artists of color who don't want to put that to the front, that's okay too. I think as we, you know, have been doing this work and having these conversations over the years, one of the reasons why we talk about platforming Black people is to platform an experience or a perspective that more people can learn from, even from the equity standpoint, you know, understanding the barriers that you know existed, those historical barriers, and platforming for that point. Do you think we're to a spot, at least where you are in the industry, where we can talk about platforming Black folks without the expectation of learning or without the expectation of a growing perspective? Have we had enough of the conversation to platform Black music just because a Black person is writing music, and that's it?
Yeah, that's been my goal for the last year and a half, to create programs that can be played anytime. But you know what this business is like, though.
Yeah,
there has to be a theme or a hook to put the music on, and I always say, all right, look, let's do that and make it so that it can be put on whatever hour of whatever shift, and it'll make sense.
Yeah. You know, again, Black thought is very diverse and varied. For me, it's hard for me to think about sidelining or not foregrounding my Blackness in a space, because for me, it's very significant. I think about the Langston Hughes essay, where he's very critical of the idea of wanting to be known just as something and not a Black something, because his argument was, being known just as that something is an aspiration to be something else, because in his case he was talking about being a writer versus just versus a black writer. His argument was that if you want to just be known as a writer, when most people think of a writer, they're not thinking about a black person. So are you aspiring to be that, or to be perceived as that? So there are many nuances to the conversation, but I think I do have to agree that I hope we can get to the point where black composers, black conductors, black musicians are being platformed in a way that they want to be platformed, and not as a means of learning or community building, not commodifying black presence in a space for something else. So, a really great conversation that we can always build and expand upon. Huge thanks again to Elijah Daniel Smith and all of the incredible things that he's doing out here in the world of new music. All right, well, we're going to talk a little bit. I'm going to talk just a little bit about Wakanda Forever in the fourth movement here. I'm not going to give away any spoilers, but I think there are just a few things that I want to speak to because they apply to the broader world. So we're going to transition into the fourth movement here with a cut from the score. Music here, of course, by the one and only Ludwig Göransson, one of the composers invited to the cookout, I suppose. We have we have accepted him. This Hollywood orchestra, I'll also notice, also conducted by the one and only Anthony Parther, a great friend of mine and a very important black maestro out here changing the world. This track from the Wakanda Forever soundtrack is called Sirens. So we'll listen to a little bit of it to get us into the fourth movement. What's your feeling about movie score music on broadcast classical radio? Is that something that you think is more appropriate in like a show about that? Do you think is appropriate to mix or useful to mix these sorts of sounds next to the Schubert leader or whatever? How do you approach, in your world, how would you approach the movie score music?
Both, because we know that movie music does well when it's part of a specialty show. I think you can point to whatever classical station around and they've got something that's geared that way. And I find it more and more showing up on my playlists.
Oh, good.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Devontae Hines, his music, and help me out. Michael Abels.
Yeah.
His film and concert music is coming across more.
Yeah. Well, first thing I want to say is rest in power to Chadwick Boseman. It's so hard for me anyway to think about an actor who took on a role and that role created such a defining cultural moment, at least for a community. I mean, maybe there are things that or folks that you can think of, but in my experience, he really stands alone in that regard. I think Wakanda Forever is one of the first films, if not the only film, that kind of had me choked up in the first seconds of the film. The movie. A lot of times when actors die, they rewrite scripts in a way to say, oh, well, they're doing this or that. Wakanda Forever directly just addressed the pain and the reality of what he was dealing with in silence, his cancer, and not really talking about it and all of that stuff. I don't think the word cancer is used, but the directors, the writers did not suspend reality for the sake of just telling some spicy story about the former king of Wakanda. They really do head on honor Chadwick Boseman in that really touching way, and it's something to me. I don't know if you can think, like I said, I don't know if you can think of another actor who had that sort of impact. I'm sure they're out there, but I just feel a lot of gratitude to know that in 40 years, my sister's kids, when they're, 20 years old or whatever, I can say, oh, well, y'all have heard of Black Panther, but I was there. And I remember when Chadwick Boseman took on the role and the cultural impact that was there. So, that's really the first thing I'm thinking about there. But what I wanted to address in this movie, and again, not, giving away spoilers, we have a lot of communities of color fighting each other as a tool for something else. Now, while this is a plot point that we can get into and pick sides or whatever who we're rooting for in the film, for me, that connects to the outside world, to the real world, because we have a lot of that. And not only just communities of color doing infighting and being divisive for the sake of control of other people. I'm also thinking about the class conversation, how we can let things like politics really divide us when everybody out here struggling, everybody doing their best, and the upper class people, the more privileged people, they're just watching us do what we
Fight
do,
for the scraps.
especially the politicians just watching us do what we do, and they live in their best life. It sounds really Pollyanna-ish to continue to say, maybe trite, a word you used earlier, this idea of the only way to really move forward, to get forward, to progress society, is to do it together. But the more that I, have been thinking about it again, that we're in November. When we crossed over into 2022 back in January, it was one of my resolutions, New Year's resolutions, to think more about class solidarity and how that can actually happen. And from my perspective, politics, as it were, and I'm not saying democracy, but politics, CNN, Fox News, headline politics is not a tool of unification. It's a tool of division. And if we're going to refer to it as a tool, we have to acknowledge that it's being used, that there's some intentionality behind that divisiveness and keeping us infighting as a class of people. What do you think? Is politics the way forward? Is politics going to save us? Is politics going to create unity for us to move forward? Or is it going to inhibit that at the end of the day?
I'll tell you what saved us. Black women and young people that went and voted in historic numbers. We need to jettison the people that are reporting from the echo chamber.
Yeah.
Because, they want to argue about how the polls have been so wrong the last 4 election cycles. Well, then why are we still listening to the people who are so wrong?
Yeah. I mean, shout out to the Gen Zers and
right.
shout out to the Black women. These election results aren't 90-10, 70-30, 60-40. Most of them are just along that 50-50 line. We're playing a numbers game. We're not playing a dialogue game. We're not playing a values game, a recognition of humanities game. We're playing a how do we get more votes on our side so that for these next 2 years or 4 years, we can have some, again, that idea of refuge. We can have some sort of refuge for a few years before we have to do it again. I don't want to diminish the role of young people and Black women in, changing the tides in many areas of the country. I also just have to acknowledge that it's not unity building at the end of the day. It's everyone digging their heels in even deeper and hoping that more people are digging their heels in on our side than the opposite.
You got it. You got it.
Can we talk about why people voted for Herschel Walker?
We can.
It's not ideals. Like I just said, it's not dialogues. It's the team sports. And it's the numbers game. As Dave Chappelle said, and we didn't talk about the opening SNL dialogue by Dave Chappelle, but as he said, it's I don't. He does. It's hard to want to talk about a Black man. I'm not going to disparage this man Herschel Walker, but let's just face it. He don't need to be up in there, and they have a runoff down there in Georgia right now. Half of the voting populace voted for this man. And then, of course, we talk about conservative evangelicals and all that sort of thing. They chose not to vote for the preacher. They chose not to support the person who has dedicated his life to the Judeo-Christian God.
Mm-hmm.
What are we dealing with here? If the actual churchiness isn't going to pull over evangelicals to that other side, it's hard to know what is. It's hard to know how to escape this team sports dynamic we're living in politically.
Consolidation of power. You put up a person that will win the election and be the rubber stamp for the rest of the party. What they start getting into the idea of retail journalism. Have you heard of retail journalism? Which is the ginning up things, the selling it, really ginning up stories, blowing them out of proportion, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're seeing retail politics.
Say more about that. I don't know if I understand commodifying talking points or.
Everybody's getting the same memo. You get the memo from corporate,
mm-hmm.
right? This is what we're talking about today. These are the talking points. Everybody starts using those.
As far as news stations or media outlets.
Politicians say those to the news outlets so that the news outlets go and they report all the talking points.
Oh, so it just creates an industrial complex.
That's what I'm saying.
That results in. So, okay. So what do? We vote for different people, or what do we need to do?
Well, I think that the way that we were heading is into this area where, if you go to an Olive Garden in Chicago and you go to one in South Carolina,
which I would never but go on.
You know what I'm saying? You're going to get pretty much the same thing, right?
Yeah,
that's the idea.
Yeah.
So vote for the local is what I'm saying.
Yes. It seems like it's easy to fall into and I'm not disagreeing with you. I think it would be easy for that to turn into sort of a states' rights thing, mm-hmm. as they like to talk
mm-hmm.
about in the South. So it is a thin line, a delicate balance between some sort of federalness along with really localized politics. Again, Maria Issa,
mm-hmm.
West Sider, all that's as local as you can get. We're talking about the actual neighborhood and advocacy for the neighborhood. There is power in that.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess what we're talking about is empowering individuals to really go into these spaces to represent their communities instead of a professional trajectory that separates, a lot of these politicians from their communities, I guess.
Mm.
Back to Herschel Walker. I don't have a problem identifying tokenization when I see it. Again, it's not about him as a person. It's just about understanding how Blackness is weaponized in that way. I hope that this is something that I don't really have to dig into, because it hopefully is obviously seen how, a certain political party has done what they can to speak to a heightened attention to diversity and all of those things, and to find someone to just platform that can do their talking points. Again, you're talking about the media, retail politics.
Mm-hmm.
Is that? I'll just ask you then. Do you think that's something that has to be unpacked? Is it obvious, or maybe it's not obvious, that a Herschel Walker is platformed through his Blackness to serve a certain purpose?
And there's the name, and make no mistake, they're leaning way into the fact how he was a small town boy, and he's supposed to be the epitome of what's possible, that he can grow up and play football and make a name for himself and now be a politician.
And this is why dialogues and conversation and being comfortable with the uncomfortable is so important, because I can imagine the person who is not Black who feels uncomfortable saying something like Herschel Walker is being platformed because he's Black, or those things, because there's the counter argument. Oh, so now you're racist. You just think that we're picking him because he's Black and and blah blah blah. But I think we just have to be able to have the conversation and not center the people, but center and understand the tactic. It's obvious to me what this was, and I guess they say the proof is in the pudding. It works or something, because half the folks down there in Georgia voted for him. I hope that we can always remain mindful of how tokenization works. Speaking specifically in the arts, just really understanding the way that certain traditions and certain status quo are perpetuated through Black people, through so-called Black excellence. We have to be able to recognize that. Otherwise, we're going to have folks like him in the Senate, and who knows what is going to happen after that. I don't know. I don't really like digging into the politics, but as I was watching Black Panther and just really applying that to some of the things that, were around me and I was fresh out of this midterm season, it has to be addressed. I think there's certainly application of this conversation in the arts. We just have to be comfortable really engaging it and addressing it and being in conversation and dialogue with people from other communities enough to know, when we're talking about tokenization and when we're talking about a diversity of Black thought. Because I'm gonna tell you right now, Herschel Walker, for me, does not represent some sort of representation of diverse Black thought. He squarely represents what it means to be tokenized by a community and weaponized for the sake of some problematic nonsense. God bless America, I suppose. Here we are, past midterms. Let's find ways to inspire and engage and explore unity and do it through the arts or wherever we exist in this ecosystem. Thank you for listening. See you next week.